In New Zealand, we have more deaths each year from kayak fishing than we do from playing rugby. That's nuts. Rugby is a tough sport with a lot of injuries, yet kayaks have a higher death toll than what rugby does. I'm going to teach you guys 2 key points that you really need to understand to be safe on the water. Once you understand these 2 key points, everything else will follow on from that. The 2 key points are to learn to identify the risk. There's a lot of things that can go wrong when we're on the kayaks. So identifying that risk means that we can move on to phase 2, which is an action plan. So to me, there's 5 key areas of risk. There's a lot of little underlying ones that associate to each area. Let's get into the 5 key ones. Boats, capsize, being separated from our kayak, being unable to get back to the launch location we started from, and accidents, things that can go wrong on the kayak that might make it hard for you to get back. So we're going to take a step back to the first risk that I've said, and that's boats. We have a low profile in the water. It's hard for boats to see us, especially when there's a decent amount of swell. So what we've got to do is be visible on the water. Avoid wearing black clothing. Make sure you have a bright hat on, like what I do, orange hat. I know you can get flags for your kayaks. I purposely don't like a flag because it tends to get in the way when I'm fishing. So I use bright clothing. As I said, the bright hat. I add colour to my kayak where I can. And I've purposely selected colours for my kayak. Like the rear of my kayaks are yellow, so they're easily visible. Personally, I've only had it once where I've had a boat coming straight at me. The boat had pulled up a cray pot. It was a recreational boatie. And he was heading towards me to lift another one. And I thought, this guy hasn't seen me. So for me, it was a case of getting the paddle, yelling at him and waving the paddle. When I could see that wasn't quite working, then I had to actually paddle out of his way. The silly bugger was actually looking at his cray pot or rebaiting it while he was heading to the next one. So you just have to be aware of that. Not every boat is going to see you for different reasons. So we've got to make sure that when boats are around, we're keeping an eye on them. If they're coming at us, we've got to make sure we're paddling out of their way if it doesn't look like they've seen us. The second area of risk is capsize. And that can happen in a number of different ways. That can happen either through the wind or waves, or a combination of both. It can happen when you're holding a big fish and the fish moves. It can tilt the center of balance on your kayak and cause you to tip out. I've seen a few cases of that. And it can also happen by people fishing too tight a drag on their reels. So when they hook up to a big fish, when that fish steams off at full speed, the process of being locked up too tight and trying to scull drag the fish can cause you to be unbalanced on your kayak and tip out. So remember, fish a light drag, and that will avoid that situation. If you do happen to capsize, hopefully you've practiced on still water like in a lake before getting back onto your kayak. But in reality, when it happens at sea, it's going to be happening when the conditions are a lot worse than what you've practiced in. So the first thing to do is stay relaxed. Make sure you stay with your kayak, don't get separated from your kayak. What you've got to do is flip your kayak back over. That's not always easy to do, but you've got to flip it back over, it's upside down, and you've got to get anything that's going to be in your way of getting back on the kayak out of your way. So you might have rods on the leashes that are floating around underneath you. You've got to pick all those up, plant them back in the rod holders. And now we come to the key point. When you go to get back on your kayak, often you've been tipped out downwind or downwave from your kayak. So what's going to happen is that when you go to hop back on, your kayak's going to ride up like this. The wind is going to get underneath your kayak, or the waves, or both. And it's going to make it really hard for you to get back on your kayak, because it's going to flip your kayak back over as you're putting your weight on to climb back on. So what you've got to do is stay focused, stay relaxed, and straight off say to yourself, I've only got 3 attempts to get back on before the cold gets to me or fatigue. So what you've got to do is you've got to make your way around your kayak to get onto the upwind side of your kayak. So that way the wind is not lifting your kayak up when you try to slide back onto it. So for me on my kayak, I've identified that risk. I've had it happen to me once before. So I have running rigs on both sides of my kayak. So I can use those to help get me around the kayak and still stay connected to my kayak while I'm doing it. I'm going to show you guys another item that I carry with me. Behind my seat, in the seat bag, I have this. So it's just a case, it's like a stirrup. If I'm having trouble getting back on, hopefully I don't have to use this, but if I'm having trouble getting back on, this goes through the handle of the kayak and can hang down in the water and allow me to put my foot in that, but like a stirrup on a horse. Right guys, carrying on from Capsize, the next risk is being separated from your kayak. If you haven't had it happen before, in a windy situation, your kayak's very buoyant and the wind will blow your kayak away a lot faster than what you can swim to get back to it. So for me, I try to minimize the risk of that happening by having rod leashes on all my rods, and I have a leash on my paddle. So the only time that I'm not connected to my kayak is either when I'm retying traces or I'm putting fish into the rear well of my kayak. So if the fish is a particularly big fish, you've just got to make sure that you're centering your balance as you slide that fish into the rear well. So to minimize the risk of getting stuck out at sea and having no way of contacting anyone, if you have separation from your kayak, make sure your VHF and your PLB or EPIRB is actually in your vest. So the fourth area of risk that I've identified is not being able to get back to your launch location. This can happen with the wind. I know in a lot of places that I fish, there's quite high cliffs. They give you a lot of protection and you won't notice the wind changing. But in these remote places that you're fishing like that, often there's river valleys and they tend to be the places that you launch, so that when you come back away from the protection of the cliff and you're trying to paddle back to where you started from, that wind can funnel out of those valleys at least 3 or 4 times the speed of the wind that's out a bit further. So I do know of a couple of guys that got caught out one night on the west coast in a situation like that, where they physically couldn't paddle back the last 800 meters to where they launched. PLB saved them and the weather was atrocious for the next week after that, so they would have ended up floating towards Australia. It wouldn't have been a good situation. So fortunately they had a plan in place to cover themselves if that happened, and that was a PLB. So my advice for you is to identify through things like Google Earth, identify areas that are at plan B. So if you can't get back to where you launched because of the wind, you just can't physically paddle back into it, where can you go that's safe to seek shelter or to get back to another beach where you can actually walk around to get back to your vehicle. So wind is one factor that makes it hard for you to get back to your launch site. There's also a few other things that can go wrong. You can have a broken paddle, there can be fatigue, and there can be injury. So in my case for injury, I carry a small first aid kit with me, and it has things like the pills I need for my heart if I'm stuck out overnight. It has antiseptic cream, it has plasters, it has a emergency blanket. It's not a big kit, but it's enough to get me through some of the key things that can go wrong with injury. The other one is fatigue, so it's knowing your limitations. As a boatie, there's a rule that you use 1/3 of your fuel to go to where you want to fish, use 1/3 to come back, and you leave 1/3 in reserve. And we've also got to think about that as kayakers with our fitness levels and what we're capable of doing. And those fitness levels could change depending on how you're feeling. You could be having a situation where you're starting to come down with the cold or the flu, and you might hit the wall a lot earlier in those situations than you would normally, and you just got to be aware of what your body's feeling and make allowances for that. Or you take enough water and food with you to fuel your body during the day to give you the energy to paddle back. Right, the next thing we need to talk about is your paddles. I always carry a spare paddle on my kayak, and you'll see that in the vids, and there's a reason for that. It's happened to me once. but I've also seen it happen to one other person. I've seen someone paddling along and the end of the paddles just dropped off, no warning. I had it when I was out the back of Barrier on a mothership trip. I was paddling along, and during the stroke of the paddle, I thought, oh, that just felt odd. It felt like there's a little bit of give in the stroke. So I stopped paddling, I lifted my paddle up, felt the end, and the glue on the paddle had just given away. And so I checked the other side of the paddle, the same thing. So just be aware of that, guys. Things like glue, they've got a certain shelf life, and when it gives, it gives. So I was fortunate that I had insulation tape with me, and I could tape up the paddle to get through the trip. But ever since then, I've always carried a spare paddle with me. Well, we're talking about paddles, guys. Sadly, last year in the Firth of Thames, there was a death from kayak fishing, where a guy was fishing with his mate. He lost his paddle. His mate went back into shore to get another paddle for him. In the meantime, I'd imagine there must have been a bit of wind, but the guy had actually fallen out of his kayak, and he ended up being found quite a considerable time later, dead. So in that case, that could have been easily avoidable by one of the two of them having a spare paddle, or just thinking when you have a problem. Like his mate, I don't know what their kayaks were like, but it's quite easy to use your running rig to connect your running rig to the person that's lost the paddle and tow them back to shore. So it's just thinking about the solutions for the problems as they come along and sorting it out. I'd hate to be that person that's had to go back to shore and you've lost your mate and you're having to ring up and tell your mate's partner that he's lost at sea. Right, guys, accidents. That's the last on my list. I had one of my viewers mention to me after my surf landing vid, he noticed that I wasn't disconnecting my paddle leash from my kayak when I was coming back in through the surf. He pointed out that years ago, when he was coming back in, he fell out and the leash wrapped around his neck with the paddle, and the weight of the kayak being pulled away was strangling him, and it becomes very hard when that's happening to actually disconnect your leash. So for him and a lot of other people, that is considered best practice to disconnect your leash from your kayak. The reason I don't do it is I like to stay connected to my kayak. So if I tip out coming through the surf, I still like to be able to guide my kayak safely in so it doesn't get damaged around the rocks. And a couple of the places that I do like to fish where there's waves, there is quite tight entries that you've got to come back through, close to rocks. So having your kayak smash up on those, damaging your sounder, to me is something I try to avoid. But in saying that, my life is more important, so I have identified the risks with those leashes. All my tackle pods, I've got 3 of them on my kayaks, have a knife secured on the top of the lid. So I've got the ability to quickly grab that if I get to my kayak and cut a leash if I get wrapped in it. But you'll also notice that my paddle leash is very short. So I'll just show you the difference. That's my leash that I've made here on the paddle, and this is a standard one. It's a lot longer. So having a shorter leash helps minimize the risk of that wrapping around me. It also makes it a lot better when I'm fishing. There's a lot less slack to twist up. But you also note that I do have a Velcro attachment, a bit like what a leg strap is for a surfer, on my paddle. So it's very easy for me to grab that and disconnect it from this end if I need to. So while we're talking about coming back in through the surf, I'll tell you a little story that happened to me one winter. It would be about 3 or 4 years ago. It was one of the South Taranaki launch sites where you go out a river. And I'd say it's a medium to large river for the area. And it was on the lower end of the tide when I came back in, so there's a lot of flow going out the river mouth when you're coming in. And I got turtled, got tipped out of the kayak on the way back in. So the normal thing that you try to do is get your kayak and swim it back to the beach or drag it back up onto the beach. But unfortunately, while I was doing that, my drogue had deployed itself. I had it underneath the cover at the back of the kayak, but there's a lot of power in the surf, and it had pulled the drogue out. It was still connected up to my running rig, and the drogue opened up and had the current of the river pulling the kayak out to sea. Well, I'm on the front of the kayak trying to drag it in. I physically couldn't drag it in because of the power of the water pulling the drogue. So I had to make my way back around the kayak. At the same time, the waves are smacking the kayak, trying to smack it into me. Pull my drogue in to deactivate the drogue and get that safely out of the way before I could pull the kayak back up onto the beach. So what I did after that incident is I've added a string to the end ring of the drogue. So now when I roll the drogue up at the end of the day before I come back in, I can physically tie the drogue up so that it's not able to activate. So just something to think about. These little things are what will trip you up. So guys, that was a crap situation to be in with the drogue, but I also learnt another valuable lesson. Middle of winter, sopping wet, I still had quite a long way to get back to my vehicle. You get cold very quick. The water's cold, it's carried on, you've got the wind chill factor. So make sure, and I do it in winter, I have a dry bag in the hull of my kayak where I've got 2 items of wool. I've got a merino t-shirt and an old merino sweatshirt, hoodie, that are in the dry bag, and I can put those on to warm up quickly so that then I can focus on getting back to my truck. Most we're coming to the end of the vid. I've just put a hat on, I'm getting cold. I know a lot of guys would be thinking, Loz, you fish by yourself a lot of the times, you do a lot of solo fishing. You know, you should be fishing with a buddy. Yeah guys, that's correct. You are right. Fishing with a buddy does add an element of safety to your fishing, but you also have to look at it, I look at it more like a chain. The chain is only as strong as its weakest link. If the person you're fishing with has a lot lower capability than you, then that can actually increase the element of risk in your day's fishing. But there'll be cases where you will want to fish with other people, like if it's someone new to kayak fishing and you're helping them out. It's great for them, they'll learn a lot quicker and they have that safety buffer that you're there. But you, as a responsible kayak fisherman, you do have to be aware that a lot of the risks that I've talked about will be happening with them. So they might not be as capable of staying on the water for 8 to 10 hours like I like to do at times. Their limit might only be 3 hours. So when you're fishing with someone like that, you also have to be watching them, what their mental state is, what their physical state is. Because when it comes to paddling back, you might have pushed them to the extremes of their limits and they're really going to struggle to make it that bit further back. While I'm talking about that, I've also just thought about the electric motors. A lot of guys get things like Bixby's to fish with because it can extend their range and make it a lot easier for their fishing. They might have injuries like sore shoulders and the Bixby makes it a lot easier. If you're one of those guys, you just have to take into allowance what happens if you have a problem with your Bixby. You're further out, or you're going to rely on your Bixby to help you get back against the wind. You looked at the windy forecast, but you thought the wind's not that bad because I've got the Bixby. If your Bixby plays up, how are you going to get back? You've got to have a plan of action for that. What a place to end the vid. This location is where the last kayak fisherman that died in New Zealand went missing, just north of the Waikowau boat ramp on the Thames coast. You've got the mussel farms out behind me. Well, we're talking about the mussel farms on the other side of the Firth of Thames. The year previous, there was a guy that went missing there and died too. There was a few other kayakers on the water that day that the weather picked up and they went back to shore, and on their way back to shore they come across him heading out. He was warned by them to not venture further out and to come back with them, but he chose to ignore it. So think about that. Is a fish worth your life?